Thank you to those who have joined. We're going to wait a minute or two as people are still coming in, and then we'll begin. Well, let me begin by welcoming you all to one of a series of presentations brought to you by the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center addressing driving inclusion in clinical research. These are going to continue now on the second Wednesday of every month, as I'll describe in a little bit greater detail in a minute. But I wanted to thank everyone for being here today and joining us in this journey. Could I have the next slide? So I want to remind you all that what we're talking about today is the work of many individuals speaking in their individual capacity. The work that this emanates from is a work group and work effort that I will describe briefly, that involved the US FDA and other affiliated organizations, but the work does not imply endorsement or reflect those views. And the MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions, which you can read on our website, and by grants. We remain responsible for the content of our materials. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is a continuation of a series that we held over the last number of months, first every other week and then every month. And you can see the kinds of topics that we've addressed in the past. You can hear the webinars of each of these, as well as download the slides that were presented at each of these on the website. It remains an active issue as to really how to do this work and how to do this well, of improving diversity and inclusion in clinical trials and clinical research, and eventually achieving health equity, something that we are far from at the moment. We intend to continue this effort. Today we will be talking about how to begin, but the next month is already planned, and I invite you to that. You'll get an email if you sign up for the distribution at the website. We are going to be talking about the inclusion of people with disabilities in research. Following that, we plan to talk about the issues of payment in clinical research and how thinking through equitable and fair payment is important for increasing diversity and making sure that the burdens are not disproportionately felt on different populations. And following that, we plan to talk about issues in translation of clinical research materials, all of which are rich areas for discussion, dissection, and figuring out together approaches to solving the challenges that bear upon recruiting equitably and thoughtfully to research. Could I have the next slide? Today, I'm really delighted to say, first I'll introduce myself. I'm Barbara Bierer. I'm the faculty director of the MRCT Center, which I'll describe in a sec, and a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. I'm really delighted to introduce, for speaking today, is our first guest speaker, Anya, who is the head of global demographics and diversity, having committed to this work for many, many years at GlaxoSmithKline. And she will bring a perspective that I think is really very useful for all of us in terms of how one prioritizes this work and secures an institutional commitment to change. That will be followed by a presentation by Chris Romero, who is the medical director of the US PanAmerican Clinical Research Organization, essentially a CRO, but more than a CRO, a group that functions to enable participation of individuals in the community, and particularly in underserved communities, making a steady and authentic commitment to those communities, such that there is trust and a willingness to participate and understand the research endeavor, something that we all aim towards and look forward to learning about. So we're thrilled that they've joined us today, looking forward to those presentations. In a second, let me have the next slide, please. For those of you who don't know the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Harvard, the MRCT Center, we are a research and policy center dedicated to improving the safety, integrity, and rigor of global clinical trials, really looking at the ethics, conduct, and regulatory environment of clinical trials. And we do that work by pulling together diverse stakeholders, that's pharma, academic, CROs, patient advocates, regulatory representatives, nonprofit or individuals from nonprofit organizations and others, to really define emerging and intractable problems, but not stopping at the definition of those problems, but really working to find approaches and solutions to them that are ethical and actionable. So we really aim to help the community to do trials in a more just and efficient way, keeping the patient and participant at the center of our work. Could I have the next slide, please? So about 3 years ago, now 3.5 years ago, we started an effort, which we've described before, to look at diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research, aware that we were not representing those that are affected by the disease or condition in the research as a participant, as in the demographics of the participants. That had been a longstanding problem, appeared difficult to solve, but nevertheless, there were elements that appeared to be tractable, that we could really take a comprehensive approach in looking at the drug development program, and then after approval for the drugs that had been developed, to understand what are the barriers to inclusion and how can we approach them. At the end of 3 years, we did put together the findings and the recommendations in a guidance, and proposed a set of tools that are now available that are generally available for use. And those tools are specifically directed to those that are not available easily and readily elsewhere. You can download both the guidance and the toolkit, which was released at the summer of last year and has been updated since. It's also available if you don't want to read it and not print it. And I wouldn't print it because it's about 400 pages. It's also available on Amazon. At cost, we don't make a profit or a penny. Could I have the next slide, please? So we did this work with a really wonderful leadership group composed of the FDA, representatives Sharday Araujo and Milena Lolich, who run Snapshot, and who's Sharday is the head of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity, Luther Clark, a cardiologist at Merck, David Strauss, a psychiatrist at Columbia University, and members of the MRCT team listed here. I have to say that this work was enriched and made complete and possible by the incredible contributions of over 50 workgroup members. And those members, which aren't listed here, but are in the document, represent really many of the stakeholders that are involved in the clinical research enterprise. And it gave us really a good understanding of how we're all interdependent in making this work successful. Could I have the next slide? So this is a multi-stakeholder contribution. It's not a formal consensus statement, but it does drive from consensus considerations. We go through for each of the pieces in the drug development program and in each component part of a clinical trial, practical and actionable recommendations for how to do this work well and do this differently, even though we appreciate that change is hard. And then the accountability section considers how each stakeholder can change the paradigm, measure it, and work on it. And the toolkit, as I mentioned, provides adaptable resources that aren't found elsewhere. Having said that, and then having done these 7 webinars through each piece of the set of documents, people still turned around and said, well, where do we begin? How do we do this? And that is the principal discussion today. Could I have the next slide? So there is, we did take a month off from these discussions in order to prepare and update the website to make it refreshed and available in a easier format, now downloadable by tool, and with case studies that are dynamic and other updates that you can see on a microsite of the MRCT site shown here. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that at news and events, you'll see all of the Leaning In series. That's where it's announced. And there is a place there to sign up for notification of updates to the diversity document, as we call it, diversity, inclusion, and equity document, as well as to the MRCT work more generally. So that's where you will find our future and our past webinar series. But today we really want to focus on sort of deciding how to begin, where to begin, and making the case for this being an institutional commitment and then executing it well. And with that, let me introduce Anya Harry. Could I have the next slide? We are going to be talking about how institutions, sites, and organizations can plan, resource, and develop a program to develop and address diversity, inclusion, in clinical research, what strategies can be used with leadership to commit to and set expectations for these initiatives. And that is what Anya will be describing, and then some examples and experiences of organizations that are building and maintaining momentum towards inclusion in clinical research, which is what Chris will be addressing. And so now, Anya, I'm delighted to introduce you.
Hi, Barbara. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this Leaning In series. And thank you very much for the opportunity for being part of the working group. It meant so much to us. I learned and hopefully I was able to contribute enough to be meaningful as well. So, and I also wanted to applaud you, Barbara, as well as MRCT for taking the leadership in addressing this issue early on, well in advance of, COVID and all of our social justice issues, shining a light on this. So thank you for taking the leadership on that. And going through this process was both fun to be able to look back what we did, and but a little bit intimidating because it really makes me have to reflect and see, well, okay, well, what are we doing? How effective are we? So really happy to talk about our approaches to having diverse representation in our clinical research and how to begin. So next slide, please. I was the one of a number of volunteers in this program. It was maybe around 6 of us, and we represented individuals across R&D at GlaxoSmithKline. So that included clinical operations, clinical development, as well as regulatory, value, evidence and outcome, and statistics. And I know I'm missing 1 or 2 individuals, but it was a real breadth of the R&D realm. And what we did in the initial time was to really make sure that we focused on what the problem was, and then kind of outline some strategies. And so that was really the focus, but in the beginning. But what was also really important was that we did have an executive advocate also on board, kind of guiding us. So happy to really lay out our 4 buckets of what I thought were critical issues that helped us to be successful. And one of those was having an advocate. Another was building that business case. And in our case, we actually built 2 business cases, one early on and then another one more recently. So happy to walk through those with you. And as well, our cross-functional framework. I'll give you some highlights, but much of that is actually in the guidance document. So happy to walk through just some of our actions. And as well, training and implementation. So next slide, please. So with this first bucket of advocacy, I hope also to not be intimidating in the sense that a lot of these examples represents what a large pharmaceutical company did, because much of this actually came from learnings from what individuals did. So I really do hope that this can show what can be done at the grassroots level as well, and just expanded upon to be representative of a large pharmaceutical company. So with our first approach, again, the goal was really to make sure that we identify the gaps as well as the unmet needs, and then to seek and align with key stakeholders and advocates within our organization. So we work to characterize those gaps in our studies, looking across the demographics, and we also look to understand what the unmet needs were. So with that, we developed some benchmarking, we looked at our historical studies, and then again, we looked across the portfolio. And what was important here was to make sure that we understood where the successes were, as well as where those gaps were. So this way, with the understanding of those successes, we could take learnings from them. In the area of understanding the needs of our patients, that's where the disparities in healthcare became quite evident. And what was exciting for me was finally to have an opportunity to be able to understand how we can impact those disparities in healthcare as a pharmaceutical company. Just really quickly, back in 1999, I was graduating from med school, and my keynote speaker was Surgeon General David Satcher. And what he talked about back then were obviously all of these healthcare disparities. So then I went off and I, went through my career, and being in pulmonary and critical care medicine, there wasn't a whole lot I could do in that realm other than make sure that I deliver good medicine. And then I moved over to the FDA and was able to take more of a public health perspective. But here now, being in pharma and being able to ensure that our clinical trials have the proper representation and making sure that our patients have access and early access gave me an opportunity to build some passion and really see that how we can kind of tackle some of those disparities in healthcare. So just a little short note to show that this really drove a great amount of passion from my side, which was just really nicely seen. So we did leverage that, the advocate, and that was really, again, to bring the voice of our efforts to all of the governance boards, right? Because that's quite important that our senior leadership knows what we're doing. As well, it's clear to me that that same advocacy also drives the vision and the need, even at the study level. What's important there is that there are several components just at the study level that are quite important here. One is making sure that that single voice is carried through the implementation of the study, that single voice driving the need for adequate representation and defining who the patients should be in the clinical trial. As well, making sure that we understand what diverse representation looks like. And that just could be talking with epidemiology or talking with a clinical scientist. And then finally, understanding, probably just as important, understanding your sites, understanding what they can do, and as well understanding what they can't do. And that's something that we're still kind of tackling with, is making sure that we understand what our sites' needs are. So that's really a key factor. So that's that advocacy at the study level or at the single individual level. And it's also quite important to make sure that our sites recognize that we see this as a collaborative effort. It's not just that we have the expectations, please go out and deliver, but also to make sure, again, that we understand what their needs are and that we're providing support for them. So next slide, please. Another component of our approach was really around that business case. Here, it was important to develop that narrative summarizing the current landscape as well as the rationale from the scientific perspective as well as the regulatory perspective and the patient perspective. Also in that was future recommendations, the business impact, risks, and as well as importantly are the implementation plan and including some of those milestones. So because we were trying to bring a solution across the organization, we developed that business case. This way we make sure that everything was pretty well organized and highly structured. So here we summarize that narrative of the landscape as well as the rationale, and we help to define in basic terms what it would mean for our patients if we didn't do this. That was quite important as well. And some of those examples are, of course, incomplete data around the safety and efficacy, as well as incomplete data around exposure levels, and maybe incomplete instructions in our prescribing information. So for our HCP, so understanding that was quite important. But really delving into that business case, we made sure that we understood the problem, right? Again, and so with that, that's where the benchmarking came in. Where were we successful and where were there opportunities for improvement? As well, that landscaping really came into play here. And then from a scientific perspective, it was important to not only understand those examples of differences in safety and efficacy, but also understanding the examples where there were differences in exposure levels, differences in metabolizing, really bringing the science behind inclusive research to the forefront. So that was important to include in that business case. And then, of course, with that, understanding again those intrinsic and extrinsic factors, right? The intrinsic factors being the biology behind the variability of responses. And then those extrinsic factors are the external forces that we see, as well as, standard of care and guidance recommendations. From a regulatory perspective, we also made sure that we included the examples of the post-marketing commitments that occurred because of lack of data around specific populations. We also included information around limitations of use, examples where patients were carved out because not enough data was included, right, about those patients in the clinical trials. We also made sure that we represented what were the expectations of our regulatory bodies, the FDA, as well as across the globe. And drug trial snapshots was quite helpful with that process also. And finally, from the patient perspective, it was important to make sure that we included that there. And that's where we really delved into those barriers. Now it's just so very clear to me what those barriers are and who's playing a role, who are the facilitators. But back then it wasn't so obvious. So that was important to include in that business case. It's always important as well to make sure that you highlight who your customers are. So not only our patients, our providers, and our payers, but also our regulators and the scientific community. Also in that business case, of course, we included our proposed business solution and the structure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. Next, we included the benefits as well as the risks, right? And then again, from the science, making sure that we get the science right, as well, making sure that our data is robust, and then can support that benefit risk profile for all of our patients. Part of that benefit risk evaluation within the business case was also making sure that we defined what were some potential unfavorable actions from us. And then as well, just as importantly, are possibly those delays in access to our medicines for our patients. We also included really quickly the timings and milestones, and then finally the cost and return of investment. That was probably the biggest challenge for us, is trying to define that return on investment, because it's quite clear there are some areas that there are tangible returns, and then there are some that are just intangible. And so while we definitely described the avoidance of many of those unfavorable regulatory decisions, we did emphasize how this aligned with our corporate value around trust and becoming that trustworthy partner to deliver good medicines to our patients, good medicines and vaccines. So it was quite important to really emphasize that. And there's where we try to drive the awareness and the value of clinical research for our patients, and the importance of that, and us taking the responsibility of doing that rather than trying to always hire a vendor to do that. So it was quite important that we were the face of what we were trying to do here in building awareness. Really quickly, so again, the business case may not be right for some, but some of the other tools that are out there are the lean canvas. That was actually quite fun to do, and that's quickly just a one-pager business plan. And then the logic model actually was something that we learned here from MRCT, which really nicely helped to crystallize the strategy, as well as the outcomes and the outputs, short-term and long-term. So some other models that can help you to crystallize your problem and your solutions. Next slide, please. So really quickly, our third bucket here was really around that cross-functional framework. Here, the goal was to make sure that we're preparing the organization for that transformation, right? And how we're going to be impacting teams, as well organizing the effort into focused work streams. That's something that we thought was quite important to do. There, we focused on, one work stream really around the data systems. Another one of the work streams was around, study site engagement, as well as community and professional organization, and then policy also. So that cross-functional framework led to a plan to transform our ways of working. Quickly for us, it was really about working with epidemiology as well as the clinical scientist leads to, again, characterize who our patients should be, who's the patient with the disease. And once we were able to make sure we understood what the diversity of demography should be, then it was working with clinical science and clinical operations to deliver on diversity. And one of the most important things there was, again, to make sure that we had that strong relationship with the sites. That's something that we're still working on, but a clear priority. And you'll hear more about that from Chris very shortly, as far as the relationship I think that sites have with the community, and that being one of the factors that show their level of success in reaching out to patients. Again, ultimately, it's really about the collaborative effort. And we also saw that there was a need to remind our physicians, our healthcare practitioners, of the importance to build awareness to their patients during their wellness visits. So really quickly, let me move on. I also recognize that many of the sites that are successful are those that really do reach out to their community. Next slide. Thank you very much. So really, our last approach was around training and implementation. There, the goal was, again, to build internal awareness and seek input, understand the drivers for the audiences. Next, to drive and embed the change within the culture for sustained impact. And then a communication plan. Ultimately, you can't over communicate enough about the importance of what we're doing and the how of what we're doing. So hopefully I'm on time. I'll stop there and hand it over to Chris. And thank you very much for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Anya, for those poignant insights. And thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to speak to an important topic and the PanAmerican experience in driving inclusion in clinical research. Next slide, please. As we're all aware, the United States is strategically located as a leader in global clinical trial conduction, with the largest number of clinical trials occurring in the United States compared to other countries. Next slide, please. However, there's discordance between where the trials are being conducted and where the global disease burden currently exists, with much of it being in the developing world and areas that are not completely represented in clinical trials. Next slide, please. Much work has been put into improving the diversity and inclusivity of clinical trials, both nationally and globally. And I definitely applaud MRCT and their leadership in this regard. But we all know that there is still work to be done. If we look at the data from the FDA drug trial snapshots, looking at 2018, the majority of clinical trial participants in the data available that year were white, with nearly half of them being from the United States of America. Now, as the situation evolved under the COVID-19 pandemic, if we look at what happened in the most recent data available in 2020, there's an increased representation of the white population, and the majority of them being in the United States for the most recent data. And that's, in my opinion, a reflection of the significant strain that the global pandemic placed upon other healthcare entities and the global health infrastructure, to where only the best equipped and resourced entities were able to keep on in this regard. Success begets success. Next slide, please. Now, great strides have been made in closing the gap in outcomes in diseases. If we look at the data on oncology outcomes and incidence and mortality, the gap between Black and white participants has narrowed. But as Desai and colleagues published in 2020, they highlight that 3/4 of participants in oncology clinical trials were white, so it's not a fair representation of the true disease burden that exists within our population. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic has unroofed many disparities in healthcare, and that holds true when we look at the data here from Texas as well. The confirmed cases of COVID-19 within my state primarily existed within a working age Hispanic male population. Next slide, please. But if we look at where the mortality lay, it was disproportionately represented within the Hispanic population. So as you can imagine, if we conducted trials trying to elucidate the pathophysiology of COVID-19, as well as therapies to treat this scourge, they need to be inclusive or we would not truly capture the scope of the problem at hand. Next slide, please. And it's reasons like that that PanAmerican has been working diligently throughout the Latin American community for a number of years to foster trust and participation in clinical trials. Kathy Leonard, our CEO, has really taken on the mantra of driving clinical outcome research by improving the health of communities simultaneously. Next slide, please. So PanAmerican has leveraged many years of experience throughout Latin America to assemble a group of clinical sites, practitioners, and community organizations to partner with on the conduct of large international global trials. One of the unique things about the PanAmerican model is that they often will use physicians and local physicians as their study specialists. And not only will they conduct the clinical trials, but they will also be involved in the education, outreach, and recruitment of participants, even in remote villages. The PanAmerican team has specialists throughout Latin America that truly give them an understanding, boots on the ground, of what the disease state is, what the needs of the community are, and how to best partner with them to not only address the need for greater diversity in clinical trials, but improve the overall health of the communities through their work. Next slide, please. And through this, it becomes this perpetual cycle of partnership construction within the communities. And it truly begins with engaging community leaders wherever they may be. That may be a senior member of a remote Pueblo community in Mexico, actually meeting them in the field where they're working, or it could be a healthcare provider or a dignitary in one of these locales. But having genuine interaction and interest in the well-being of their communities and engaging with their clinics, schools, and other entities within their community to conduct education, health fairs, and screening events, not always related specifically to a trial at hand. And this engenders trust and collaboration with the community, which then feeds back to this ongoing cycle of interest and interaction. Next slide, please. And how this is done traditionally is through many of the modalities that we're accustomed to. Health fairs and educational events out in the community to teach people about health and wellness in even resource-limited settings. It also includes disease screening. Many of these communities may not have ready access to healthcare providers, and not only to identify disease, but to put the participants in these screenings in contact with local health entities where they can continue to receive ongoing care. And if rare diseases are identified in communities, putting them in contact with expertise, and sometimes that does even include referral to rare disease clinical trials. And partnering with areas to improve their healthcare infrastructure through sustained involvement and interaction. Next slide, please. If you spend some time with the toolkit that was published by MRCT, you'll see a lot of these activities that PanAmerican has been conducting for years really mirror the guidance document and how they recommend to best forge relationships for ongoing sustained involvement in clinical trials to improve our understanding of how to best identify and treat disease globally. Next slide, please. So I'm very fortunate to be part of the PanAmerican team, and we're located here in the Rio Grande Valley of Deep South Texas, which I'm happy to call home. And it's a unique location. It's a broad geographic swath across 4 counties on the US-Mexico border. And we're the bookend to San Diego on the opposite end of the US-Mexico border. Roughly 1.3 million inhabitants reside in the Rio Grande Valley, but this is likely an underestimate because many of the community members have felt nervous about participating with prior census and count. We face a lot of the same disparities that exist in other minority communities throughout the United States and truly around the world, with large numbers of individuals residing below the poverty line, lack of appropriate education, and unfortunately, some of our metropolitan areas are identified as some of the most obese and least physically active in the nation. Next slide. And these disparities, unfortunately, do translate into a significant amount of disease burden. This was highlighted in an article published in the Texas Observer that I was interviewed for in 2019 that chronicled the rampant level of amputations occurring in the diabetic population in Deep South Texas, something that I'm all too familiar with as an internal medicine physician down here. Next slide, please. Another of the nuances to our community is the existence of what's called colonias. These are unincorporated communities, often the edge of townships and cities, that lack the basic infrastructure that many of us are just accustomed to, be it trash pickup, sanitation and sewer, and in some cases even running water. There's an estimated over 1,200 of such colonias across the Rio Grande Valley area. And unfortunately, these do become hotbeds of disease and are home to some of the most socially marginalized people within our region. Next slide, please. The Rio Grande Valley is the southernmost point on the US-Mexico border and has been a natural migration route throughout the Americas for a long time. As we see an increase in transborder migration recently, we're on the forefront of this issue as well nationally. And this has the potential to put significant strain on local resources and health infrastructure. Next slide, please. It's with this backdrop that we are actively engaging in high-level clinical research. And the last year, we're able to participate in the Impacted clinical trial, which was published in NEJM in December of this last year. And in the pre-publication press release by the sponsor, they highlighted the fact that the majority of study participants came from minority or underserved populations, which is a great tale, especially in the era of the strain that we're under with COVID-19. Next slide, please. I think there are some key steps to achieving success in such environments. And chief among them, in my opinion, is identifying and recruiting local talent and knowledge to your fight. In this, a genuine interest and service to the community will engender trust and support by the people that we are truly working to improve the health of. And we are perpetually cognizant of the fact that trust is earned and lost, and it can never be purchased, sold, or transferred. That these relationships do take time to build. They're often done one-on-one and face-to-face, and that effort needs to be put in place for success. Next slide, please. When it comes to research staffing, we've done our best to recruit locally and then train these individuals in how to conduct clinical trials. As a result, our study team is culturally sensitive and aware of the nuances that exist within our community. A wiser man than myself once said that you hire the smile and train the skill, and I truly believe that's true. There's genius and raw talent everywhere, and identifying that and recruiting it to clinical research is very much attainable. The staff then have connections to the community and often have existing connections with the medical community that allow rapid integration of our projects. And I have this image here to highlight. It's a statue that existed at Ground Zero, and it commemorates the special operators who went into Afghanistan after the 9/11 attack and worked with the indigenous population to achieve early strategic success in very challenging, austere environments, but did so by achieving the trust and respect of the local population that they were there to help and serve. Next slide, please. And it's community service that is at the forefront of our approach to these regions that we operate within. Many of the traditional activities, healthcare, community outreach events, are difficult to achieve in the era of COVID-19, but I think that there's never been a greater need for volunteerism and community advocacy as exists within this global pandemic. And as such, we have worked to support COVID-19 mass testing sites in the colonias free of charge, and have also worked with mass vaccination efforts. We've partnered with local entities to promote health literacy, health and wellness in these underserved communities. And also we've directly reached out to public health departments to identify what their needs are and see how we can best support them. We have reached out to our local university, the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley, which is a minority serving institution, and work with their researchers on how we can support their ongoing efforts in the community as well. Next slide, please. I think some low-hanging fruit action items that can be taken are building those sustained organic community engagement activities. Truly, it's just picking up the phone, reaching out to health departments and nonprofit organizations saying, how can we help? That's something that anybody can do starting today. One thing that we've also done is we've worked with local media and news organizations and built some excitement and a groundswell of interest in the cutting edge clinical research that's happening right here in our own community. We also realize that it's important not only to try and promote the research we're conducting, but also to care and promote the projects that are of interest to our community partners. For example, when we talk about our mass vaccination efforts, we have partnered with a nonprofit organization that services individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental issues who are unfortunately being marginalized from vaccination. We've helped bridge that gap. Working with local schools and universities to identify talent and get them excited about a career in clinical research, because as we all know, it's a 14 to 20 year path to build a new MD, PhD clinical scientist. And if we are going to fill that gap that exists, we need to begin on it in earnest now. Next slide, please. Some of the things that we see as ongoing barriers or challenges to overcome are the differences that may exist in regulatory environments between the United States and areas of Latin America, where some things may take a month here in the US, may take 3 months, and in some locations up to 2 years to occur. So some sites are behind the 8 ball from the get-go. Also, the ready availability of translated study material at the start of a study. If sponsors are going to identify that it's important to include non-English speaking individuals in a clinical trial, having those translated materials available at the beginning enables those sites that are targeting such populations to be on par and competitive with other locations. We need to continue to bridge the gap in community awareness, both in the community at large, but also in the medical community, about the importance of clinical trial. We found that some decentralized clinical trials have been a technical barrier for our most marginalized portion of the population, and also our elderly participants. So I think it's important to have a contingency plan in place for those individuals, be it a paper backup if needed. One of the things that does keep me up at night is the uninsured patients who have newly diagnosed disease as participating in a clinical trial and undergoing screening, or heaven forbid, may have an adverse event that requires hospitalization and burdens them with significant medical bills. I don't have a ready answer to this, but I think that's something we need to think about in earnest. Here in the Rio Grande Valley, we have a large migrant population. It's been that case for truly centuries. And these individuals, unfortunately, are not able to participate in clinical trials, oftentimes because of the time window of participation. And finding a way to work around that is also something I think we should endeavor towards. And of course, to continue to bridge the gap in trained and experienced personnel to conduct the trials for the therapies of the future. And I thank you all for your time and interest.
Thank you so much to both of you. Really inspirational, aspirational talks, and so good to see models of individuals, groups, and organizations that have made it work. Maybe we could go to the gallery view and have a couple of minutes at least for discussion. As the questions are coming in, a couple of questions that have come in. One is, you know, why do you, could you just sort of summarize why the business case was necessary? And, you know, how did that help you if the organization was committed already, which I'm sure GSK was, for instance, and, you know, why the formalism?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that. That framework and the structure and laying out all of those aspects that I went over really puts the full force of the organization behind this effort. So while R&D might have been driving a lot of this, or our research and development group might have been supporting a lot of this, making sure that other aspects of the organization are also on board contributing. So commercial, for example, you know, our MSAs, our medical liaisons, our marketing group as well, our supply chain. So a business case gets reviewed and can be therefore supported by the full force of the organization. As well, what it helps us to do is to make sure that, you know, the good science is laid out, what needs to be done. As well, it makes sure that we're in compliance with our regulators and our overseers. And really, I think the bottom line is making sure that it's clear that we can deliver what our patients need. So everything is laid out there, the milestones, et cetera. So it kind of just really puts a good structure behind what we need to do to continue to do good science and comply, and making sure that we're keeping our patients focused. But again, it really puts the full force of the organization behind it. I think
It
you're on
really
mute.
does sound as if it's both a business case, but also a roadmap of what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, so that's why I really like the logic plan. I like the lean canvas. So it wasn't to say that I had all of this time to develop all of these models, but each seemed to bring a little bit of a different value to our understanding of the problem and our roadmap. So spot on. Thank you.
Yeah. And Chris, I wanted to understand for your organization, how do you sustain the commitment in between having these clinical trials that come to you to be executed? Is that as a volunteer parts of what you do as good citizens of the community, or is there a way that this sort of threshold work to maintain the enthusiasm, the commitment, the engagement with the community is part of your plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think part of it is, for lack of a better term, the addictive nature of the good work that comes out of the positive interactions that we have with our community and our allies. Once we get plugged in with public health efforts or these nonprofit organizations and get behind their mission and their goals, it's easy to just sustain that activity, because there's a lot of really good people in the world doing good work every single day and night, and they need a lot of help. As you could see from the slides, I highlighted some of the disparities that exist within our community, and they don't disappear. So there's always need for individuals with healthcare background, with an analytical mind, to participate in the ongoing efforts of our community partners. We can be their force multiplier.
That's a great. And Anya, did you want to respond to that as well, or no?
Yeah, I reiterate everything that Chris said. I'm completely in agreement with that. Much of our engagement activities are not related to what we're doing with our clinical trials. And so it's really the focus on really empowering patients, building awareness, as the product of our patient engagement activities.
So a couple of questions from the audience. First for Chris, I think, do you find evidence of racial concordance, that is, patients enrolling in trials with investigators of the same race or ethnicity in your work? There has been some evidence of that. Of course, it's not a requirement. Many people, race or ethnicity discordant, can enroll. But do you find that that's a better model, and have you been collecting data in that at all?
We haven't specifically been collecting data to that point, but I think that it is an accurate depiction of the situation. And there's a recent publication that came out just looking at the representative leadership in medical education, the need for diversity in medical school faculty. The same can be said for healthcare at large. And when we have individuals from our community that we have recruited to participate in leadership roles within our organization and clinical trials, they come to it with a great heart and understanding of the community that they're involved with in serving. So I think it does feedback nicely.
Thank you. For Anya, another question from the group. Can you share examples of successful integration of diverse patient voices into clinical trials at GSK? At what stage of drug development are those patient engagement teams and advocates involved? And how do you, and I'm adding this from the question in the chat, how do you make sure that those patient voices are truly representative of the communities that you wish to serve?
Thanks so much. Great question. So this started out with our oncology team. They really developed an oncology patient council. That group gets trained under contract, and they review our protocols. And when they're looking through our protocols, they are looking for the assessments. How burdensome are these assessments? How invasive? They'll also even look at the eligibility criteria. And again, that's based on some training to make sure that we're not leaving out some of our patients. So those are just some simple examples. And that started out in oncology, and we're moving now to our other therapeutic areas and to be able to develop patient councils in those areas. Right now, we're looking at that mainly in pretty much phase 1B and phase 2 and on. So wherever there are patients with particular diseases. However, we do obtain some input with some of our vaccine studies where there are healthy volunteers. Again, looking at the burden of the protocol, the burden of the assessments, as well as the patient-reported outcomes, and even to a certain extent, providing feedback on the patient-facing material. We also were fortunate to be able to do a mock trial simulation and have actual patients walk through a particular trial. Yeah, really, really fun. And so again, some great insights from that. Your last question was, how do we make sure that the voices are properly representative? That team works very closely with us. I'm so fortunate of that, and that the patient engagement team gets from us our demographic profile that we developed, right? To tell us, based on the epidemiology, who should be in our trials, right? Who has the diseases, and therefore who should be in our trial. And so based on that, they try to make sure that there is some representation. So still work to be done, but that's a direction that we're working in. So thanks so much for those questions.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more if we could, which is to Dr. Romero. Firstly, thank you and PanAmerican for the work in the community. It's admirable. Would it be possible for you to highlight some of the specific and more common challenges that you experienced in working with the community and how you overcame those challenges?
Unfortunately, I have the bias of proximity of time with many of the challenges that we faced in the COVID-19 pandemic. The things that we want to do and address face-to-face with our community and our leadership is is not feasible oftentimes. Case in point, we're wanting to do some education around diabetes and pediatric obesity. So we are working with a local group to stand up webinars such as this, that any of the community members that are interested in finding out more can dial into, so that we can continue that education even in the midst of appropriate restrictions.
Thank you. Well, with that, I'm afraid we're out of time, with the exception of 1 minute to say a huge thank you to both of you and to the audience. And thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next month, when we will be talking about inclusion of individuals with disabilities in studies that do not address the disability itself, about other non-overlapping conditions. So thank you again, Dr. Harry, Dr. Romero. This has been wonderful. And thank you also for your contributions to the work group and efforts from the outset. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.